Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the 16th Communication Graduate Cactus Conference. This year's theme, Transitioning, invites and explores scholarship that analyze shifts in techno-political developments and the relationship between changing technologies and labor that focus on our increasingly precarious environmental circumstance and the work that addresses current social movement and the calls for change to the political climate. My name is Blue. I'm a graduate student here at Carleton University. I will be your co-host, supported by conference co-chair team behind the curtain, Polly, Brittany, and Maddie, as well as our amazing communication and journalism department and faculty of public affairs. I have the pleasure to sharing the stage with Dean Brenda O'Neill, Director Josh Greenberg, Professor Irina Knezevich, and our keynote speaker, Paul Taylor. For those who don't know us yet, the annual CGC Conference is one of the largest graduate student conference in Canada. First, we'd like to acknowledge that Carleton University was founded on the traditional unceded territories of the Algonquin Nation. Please know that you can ask questions and view links in the Zoom chat. We also want to know that this event is being recorded and will be shared afterwards. And you can follow the conversation on Twitter with hashtag CGC Conference. And we will share that hashtag in the chat as well. This year's CGC Conference is supported in part by funding from Communication and Media Studies program, the Faculty of Public Affairs, the Office of Associate Vice President, Teaching and Learning, Canadian Journal of Communication, Canadian Communication Association, and Graduate Students Association. We are very happy to have Dean O'Neill as our new FPA Dean. Thank you so much for taking this position. Without further ado, let's welcome our Dean of the Faculty of Public Affairs, Dean Brenda O'Neill, to say a few words of welcome. Hi, Dean O'Neill. The virtual is all yours.
Hi, Boo. Thanks very much for that introduction. I also want to thank Holly, Brittany, and Maddie for all your work in pulling the conference together. I can't imagine that it's been especially easy under pandemic conditions. I mean, putting together a conference under regular conditions is hard enough. So thank you for all the work I know that you've put into this. I'm here this morning I was asked to extend a special welcome to everyone joining you today and also over the next couple of days. So welcome to the 16th Annual Communication Graduate Caucus Conference. This long-running event, I think, is a tribute to the strong interdisciplinary research amongst the graduate students in communication and media studies at Carleton. I think it equally speaks to the quality of the graduate program itself, to the faculty and staff that work so hard to make it as successful as it is. The theme for this year's conference, I think, is most fitting. It's transitioning. In the past year, I think we've all witnessed a number of transitions from in-person to online, in the appearance and use of new technologies. I think in the new uses for existing technologies, in world events, and most certainly in citizens rising up to demand social justice. I think taking stock of them, these social, political, geographical events could not be timelier. The depth and breadth of this year's virtual conference, I think, is equally impressive, with presentations on topics that include such things as technology and its impact on labor, climate change, energy and resource transitions, and calls for social change, institutional transformation, and system reform. The two keynote speakers, Paul Taylor and David Nyborg, I think are sure to offer insightful and thought-provoking talks. One certain to have everyone thinking about these issues long after I think the conference is wrapped up. During the pandemic, students in the Faculty of Public Affairs have shown incredible adaptability and a willingness and ability to transition based on life circumstances. You've not only had to adapt, but you've done so, I think, with great success. In the pre-pandemic world, conferences were face-to-face. People congregated to them, sometimes traveling long distances to attend. But I think one thing that the pandemic has shown us is that there's new ways of coming together to think about topics and ideas, to present our research, and to exchange. So congratulations on everyone that's going to present over the next couple of days for your hard work, for your willingness to participate. I think your research is so integral to the mission of the Faculty of Public Affairs, which is to build better societies and stronger democracies, to address regional and global challenges, and most importantly, to enhance and inform public debate. This event is part of the faculty's research series, an ongoing celebration of diversity in research in the Faculty of Public Affairs. There are other events going on this month. I hope you may want to look them up and see if there's anything else that tickles your fancy. One this week is Who is the Political Party? Is the FA Research Excellence Award public lecture by one of our faculty members, Bill Cross. He's going to discuss the complexity of political parties and the roles of the various actors within them. You can visit the FPA website at carleton.ca/FPA/events for more information. So thank you for allowing me to welcome everyone. I wish you all the best over the next couple of days. I hope you leave with more questions than you came in with. That's always the sign of a good conference. So best of luck to everybody.
Thank you, Dean O'Neill. Now I want to turn this over to our Director of School of Journalism and Communication and the Professor of Communication and Media Studies, Professor Josh Greenberg. Hi, Professor Greenberg.
Thank you, Blue, and good morning, everybody. As Blue said, my name is Josh Greenberg, and it is my pleasure to serve as the Director of the School of Journalism and Communication and Head of the Communication and Media Studies program. If you're one of the many grad students joining us from other universities virtually this year, I welcome you on behalf of all faculty, staff, and students in Communication and Media Studies. The conference is celebrating its 16th anniversary, and it really gets better every year. I've had the opportunity to review the conference program. It looks like you're heading into a series of very high quality, stimulating discussions on a number of timely topics under the very timely theme of transitioning. So congratulations to the conference organizing committee for putting together such an amazing event under extraordinarily challenging circumstances. And of course, to all grad students in Communication and Media Studies for showcasing the outstanding work that you do in our MA and PhD programs. As mentioned, the conference is once again being held in conjunction with the Faculty of Public Affairs Research Series. I want to thank our Dean, Brenda O'Neill, for her support of the conference, and the faculty's events and outreach coordinator, Stephanie Boss, for all of her support with our organizing committee and making sure that this event would run without a hitch and with great success. Thank you again for your support of this conference. I wish you all stimulating, challenging, and intellectually enriching experiences. I look forward to attending the sessions. Certainly, of course, want to also thank our keynote speakers who are helping to make this event so special. Welcome to both of you. I look forward to hearing your remarks and wish you all a successful conference. Thanks.
So it's my turn now. Good morning, everybody. I'm Irina Knazovich. I'm a faculty member in the School of Communication, in the School of Journalism and Communication Media Studies program. It is my honor to be moderating this session this morning. I will start by first echoing the sentiments just expressed by Dean O'Neill and our chair, Josh Greenberg. I also would like to echo the sentiment of thanking and congratulating the organizers for mounting this conference. I need to start with some technical things. I know most of you are familiar with Zoom protocols, but I just want to make sure that everybody has their bearings. So technical stuff is we opted for a regular Zoom meeting rather than a webinar format to try and as much as possible replicate the feel of being in a room together. That means that we're not using the Q&A feature that you might be used to in webinars. We're actually using a meeting format, and that means that we will ask you to actually ask your questions in person. Now, bear in mind, I am the sole moderator for this event, so please make sure that your microphones are muted unless you are asking a question. If you're unable to actually unmute your microphone, or there's background noise or any other reasons why you don't want to just speak directly into the camera, I will keep the chat panel open so you can put a question into the chat panel. If you are asking a question following Paul's presentation, I will also ask you to keep your questions brief so that we can have as many of them as possible in the discussion time allotted. I will also ask you to reserve live questions to questions and not comments. If you just have comments that you'd like to share with Paul or the conference organizers, you can put them into the chat box. Once you're ready to ask a question following the presentation, please just raise your hand. You will find the feature at the bottom of the screen. Raise your hand and I will pick you in order that I see your hands popping up. I think that's about it. I will remind you again that this lecture is being recorded and it is going to be made available via the Communication and Media Studies YouTube channel. Again, if you want to comment or say anything as the presentation is happening, please use Twitter hashtag CGC Conference. And I will now move on to the actual introduction of our keynote speaker for this morning. So properly introducing Paul Taylor could be a presentation in itself. So forgive me if I leave out a few things for the sake of brevity, so I can turn the mic over to him. Equality, justice, opportunity. Those are the words that best summarize Paul Taylor's work. He's a community leader, activist, commentator, columnist, and an educator. He has run nonprofits in British Columbia and Ontario. He has taught at Simon Fraser University. He has served on many boards with organizations with such stature as Food Secure Canada and the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. He also ran as an NDP candidate for the Parkdale Hyde Park riding in the last federal election. One of the most prominent voices for social justice in Canada, Paul has dedicated his life to eradicating poverty and becoming a voice for the voiceless. He is a strong visionary with a dream to level the playing field across many dimensions. Just like farmers grow food, Paul Taylor grows communities. I knew little about Paul when he took over the helm of FoodShare in 2017. FoodShare is Canada's premier community food organization that works on systemic change, from good food boxes and school gardens to education and policy intervention. When its previous director, Debbie Field, was stepping down from that role, I asked her how anyone could possibly fill her shoes. She responded with a knowing smile and said, quote, "You have no idea. Paul will take this organization to another level," unquote. Over the last 4 years, I have witnessed exactly that unfold. Paul has made FoodShare a household name, but perhaps more importantly, he now plays a central role in contemporary social justice efforts in Canada. You can find Paul's work everywhere. His remarkable communication style and media savvy have made him a central voice for social justice advocacy. Paul is unapologetic, but thoughtful. His statements are profound, but accessible. He speaks clearly and raises issues across any medium, from the Twitter sphere to television appearances. You can also read his work in print in various publications, most recently as a regular contributing columnist with the Toronto Star. If you follow Paul's work, you can see him cover pretty well everything: food access and food justice, racism and colonialism, labor rights, fair wages and sick leave. Poverty and income inequality are always intertwined with our collective disregard for community and equity. Paul Taylor is impeccable with his messaging, and he uses the spotlight to effectively push community work into public policy. Simply put, he turns talking into walking. It is a privilege to have him address this gathering, and I'm humbled that he agreed to do this. I'm going to turn the mic over to you now, Paul. Welcome.
Wow, Irina, thank you so much. I think that is the most generous and kind introduction I've ever received. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Yeah, I'm moved. Thank you. It's a real honor to be here this morning, and maybe one thing I'll say before I dive into that is, the most important experience that I've ever had in my life didn't come in a classroom or in a nonprofit organization or in a boardroom or anywhere other than at home, growing up as a low-income kid in downtown Toronto. I think that's informed so much of the way that I see the world and so much of the way that I kind of process the things around me, and has inspired my approach to the work that I do. So as we dive in, yes, thank you so much for having me. If this year, even just only from my little laptop screen, it's still a pleasure to be with you today. I hope that everyone's loved ones are holding up okay during this really difficult time, particularly as we are in the midst of a third wave, at least here where I am in Toronto. I also hope that you receive the remarks that I share in a good way, with an open heart and an open mind. With that said, I want to acknowledge, I know many of you are on the traditional territory of the Algonquin. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that I'm joining you from the traditional territory of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabeg, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. I also want to acknowledge the many nations of Indigenous people who presently live on this land, several of whom are dear friends, several of whom are on the front lines of land and water defense. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be on these lands that I proudly call home. Something I've been thinking about, talking about a fair bit recently, and it has to do with land acknowledgements, actually, and how they take place. Many of the land acknowledgements that I've heard, you may have heard similar land acknowledgements, there's that moment after the land acknowledgements where we're all encouraged to think about the role of settlers in advancing reconciliation. That pause where everyone is pretty quiet. And I think that's incredibly, incredibly important. But increasingly, I've been finding myself thinking, well, wait, what about me? I'm not a settler. My ancestors didn't come here in pursuit of economic opportunity. The reality is my ancestors were stolen from their homes, their families, their communities, and brought to Turtle Island against their will. So for me, today, it's become really important today, and in fact, every day, to also acknowledge folks that are on this land that are neither Indigenous to Turtle Island, nor are we settlers. Folks on this land whose ancestors arrived here as a result of the horrific experience of the transatlantic slave trade. It may not be February, but I'm still going to take a moment to encourage you, especially those that haven't had a chance to really think about this, to consider what it would mean to be ripped from your homes, from your families, from your communities, stripped of everything meaningful to you, placed in chains, loaded onto boats, having no idea where you're going, unable to move, seeing people that look like you die at the hands of those that don't, and then being brought to another side of the planet, so that you can be sold into a life of chains and ongoing violence and exploitation. I'm also highlighting this because I think it's not only important to me, as I ground myself in why I'm here and what my responsibility looks like, but I also, as Irina mentioned, I work at a food organization called Food Share, and slavery is part of the very foundation of our modern industrial food system. This modern industrial food system that likely provided our breakfast today, it'll also provide our lunch and our dinners. It's really important for us to recognize that the modern industrial food system was and continues to be inspired by white supremacy. I can't do the work that I do around food without recognizing that essential truth. And that truth is that bodies of my stolen and enslaved ancestors were forced to farm on land stolen from Indigenous peoples in equally as horrific ways. Stolen people farming on stolen land. It's why I view struggles for Indigenous sovereignty and Black liberation as inextricably linked. So during that moment of pause, I think about what solidarity with Indigenous people, especially those on the front lines of land and water defense, looks like for me, and why it must remain important at the forefront of my mind, both as I live and as I do the work that I do. That thinking is what's inspired me to make several trips in solidarity and to offer material support to Indigenous land defenders at 1492 Landback Lane. that all these years later continued to be forced to resist ongoing colonial and state-sanctioned violence against Indigenous people, with little to no regard for waterways, foodways, and the land. This is, clearly not a thing of the past. It's ongoing. It's persistent. White supremacy continues to inform our modern industrial food system in many, many ways. The fact that we've made food a commodity means that it affects who has food to eat and who doesn't, as well as who gets hired and paid to lead the solution finding. Both when it comes to challenging food insecurity in spaces, in public policy spaces, so in government and in charities across the country, as well as who is forced to work without institutional support and the resources required to challenge food insecurity at the community level. One of the things that, what I see is, in essence, folks are volunteering to fight against the systems that continue to oppress us all. It's often BIPOC community leaders doing this heavy lifting. By BIPOC, I mean Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. Community leaders that are doing this heavy lifting on protecting our human rights and the environment, while white charity leaders earn the pay, build the careers, write the books on these issues. This is a prime example of systemic racism and white supremacy in action. And we need to be thinking about that critically, I think, all the time if we're going to defeat it. But going back to our food system, it's the exploitation of Black and brown bodies that to this day remains the primary source of manual labor on predominantly white-owned farms right across Turtle Island and beyond. In Canada, there's a program through the Seasonal Agricultural Worker Program. Again, the imported bodies of Black and brown migrant agricultural workers who harvest all of the local produce that we enjoy and celebrate arrive here and are effectively shackled to a single employer from the moment they arrive to the moment that they leave. It's outrageous, really. Who else do we shackle to a single employer with little to no rights? Who else do we allow to be treated like this? But even more importantly, I think, why? I think by now I've articulated why I think this happens. These essential food system workers have to request permission to leave the farms that they work on, and they can be sent back to their home countries if they raise any concerns, be it labor concerns or around their fundamental human rights. Heck, they can even be sent back if their employer doesn't think they smile and nod often enough. Again, this is absolutely absurd, but we let it continue, all of us. And in the context of a deadly global pandemic, during the growing season, these essential food workers don't receive hazard pay. There's been reports that they aren't always provided with an adequate supply of PPE and are routinely forced to live in close quarters, making it impossible to practice physical distancing. We know what the outcome of that is. It's a death sentence. We call these folks migrant agricultural workers, but who are we kidding? They are the modern day slaves that fuel the modern industrial food system. In fact, I didn't learn about their crucial labor in this food system as a child. Instead, many of you may resonate with you, but instead I was taught to sing about old MacDonald and his farm, E-I-E-I-O, and on his farm he had Black and brown bodies breaking their backs to harvest our local strawberries. When will we stop telling ourselves these fairy tales that erase the labor and often exploited labor of those who aren't racialized as white? Remember, right now, in the middle of a pandemic, a deadly pandemic, it's also Black and brown people, mostly Black and brown women, that are forced onto public transit to get to work in factories, processing plants, distribution centers, long-term care homes, and sanitizing our workplaces and classrooms. In Ontario and in most provinces, if these workers get sick, they're still forced to go to work because they can't afford not to. They need to feed their families. I've come to realize that we have endearingly called these workers essential. We even bang pots and pans for some of them. But what we've done is we've foisted these folks to the front lines of the economy, yet we continue to deny them livable wages, appropriate protections, and things like paid sick days. Yet, as has been said, COVID certainly doesn't discriminate, but our racist systems, institutions, and structures surely do. We can't address racism in this country unless we acknowledge that it's a thing, and it's causing significant health inequities. It is a public health crisis, which requires us to fight it as vigorously as we fight the pandemic. Combating racism isn't a one-day workshop or a checkbox on an organization's training calendar, or a half-hearted response to an organizational PR crisis. It involves profoundly rethinking the ways in which our systems work and the ways those systems ultimately act as barriers to something as fundamental as food to eat. Our work together has to go beyond, especially as we think about issues like food insecurity and poverty. And how we respond to these issues must go beyond handing out donated peanut butter and jelly and corporate waste to solve food insecurity. If we really want to tackle these issues, we have to be centered in a commitment to food justice, which must include working to challenge the oppressive systems like white supremacy and settler colonialism, while advancing things like Indigenous sovereignty and Black liberation. As has been mentioned, I work at an organization called Food Share Toronto, and I'm proud, really, really proud to work alongside the team of amazing human beings that I do. We are committed to having some of the difficult conversations that I think have been ignored and neglected, including in society's solution-finding spaces. We're also unequivocally committed to action and ultimately the justice that has eluded communities for far too long. It's actually FoodShare's commitment to food justice that inspired us to partner with a research group out of the University of Toronto, a group called PROOF, Food Insecurity Public Policy Research Group. And we partnered with them due to be quite frank, an appalling lack of research in this area. We sought to get a better sense of what was happening for Black Canadians when it came to food insecurity. What we learned a great deal, and that research challenged, I think, widespread and commonly held notions of food insecurity in this country. So how it started is we took a look, we analyzed what's called the Canadian Community Health Survey from 2005, which is when it was first introduced, right up until 2014. Now, again, this is the first, we have not come across any evidence that an analysis like this has taken place in Canada thus far until we embarked on this work. So here are the things we learned. And maybe before I share what we learned, what had been happening previous to this research was that as folks report out on food insecurity in this country, it had been largely pretty aggregate. Sometimes we looked at certain drivers as to look at where there were correlations between identities and food insecurity, but there had never been any research that looked specifically at what was happening for Black folks in this country. And I remember when I started at Food Share, and I would visit some of our programs across the city of Toronto, and pretty consistently I thought, wow, there's a disproportionate number of Black folks accessing our programs. And I thought, what's happening here? Because we Black people in Toronto make up a smaller percentage of the population, but seemingly a larger percentage of the population accessing charitable-based food interventions. So we weren't surprised when we found that if you live in a Black household in Canada, you are 3.5 times more likely to be food insecure than if you live in a white household. We weren't surprised to learn that 12% of white children live in food insecure households versus 36% of Black children. What did surprise us is some of the things that challenge what we had commonly understood, across this country about food insecurity. For example, if someone lives in a lone parent household in Canada, they are more likely to be food insecure, of course, because there's less income, more likely to be less income if it's one income source. In Black families, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it's a single parent household or a dual parent household. The risk and prevalence of food insecurity was consistently high. We also commonly understood, again, when we look at aggregate data, that newcomers to Canada were typically more likely to be food insecure than folks who had arrived in the country and had been here for a long time. For Black Canadians, it didn't matter whether or not they were here. They were new to the country, had been here for a long time. Again, the prevalence remained high. Home ownership. I think it makes sense that, home ownership acts as a protection against food insecurity. If you've got enough loot to buy a home and enough credit and all of that stuff to buy a home, you're less likely to not have the food that you need. In fact, Black homeowners, there are 14.3% of Black homeowners that are food insecure, which was alarming to us, especially so when we recognize that that's just about the same 14.5% of white renters that are food insecure. So home ownership for Black Canadians not providing the same protection around food insecurity that it does for white homeowners. Social assistance, another thing that threw us for a loop. We saw that, and before I say this, I should say, really important to note, although I'm going to talk about social assistance and food insecurity, in Canada, 65% of people that are food insecure actually derive their income from employment. So these are people that are working and are not making enough to buy the food that they need. But there is a percentage of folks that are on social assistance. And if you're on social assistance, you're more likely to be food insecure. I think that makes sense. What threw us was the fact that white folks in Canada receive more on social assistance than Black folks do. And I was stumbled. I was stunned because I had always assumed, welfare was, you punch in these numbers and an equation, and then a figure pops up, a figure that's always too low, but a figure pops up nonetheless. Until we realized that, of course, social assistance figures include disability income. What that's telling us is that white folks in Canada are more likely to be approved for disability than Black folks. This is what's accounting for that variance. Another thing I'll add, when it comes to seniors, one of the things that folks may not know is your food insecurity decreases pretty significantly as soon as someone hits retirement age. And that's because of the existence of a basic income in this country that exists right now by way of the guaranteed income supplement for seniors, old age security, and of course, seniors being able to draw upon their retirement income, other sources of retirement income. For Black Canadians, it doesn't matter when hitting retirement age doesn't again provide the same protection against food insecurity. The prevalence for Black seniors remains high. So, this is the way that anti-Black racism clearly continues to plague our society. This research told us that it's inflicting continued harm and violence on Black people across this country. It hadn't really been a part of conversations about, nationally, how does Canada respond to food insecurity? We hadn't ever really had conversations about how important it was to combat anti-Black racism, and that combating anti-Black racism was one of the things that was essential to combating food insecurity for Black Canadians. We have to tackle this pervasive public health crisis in our society. We have to start in our homes, in our communities, and in all of the places that we're connected to. As I've noted, it's a significant problem when it comes to charities and nonprofit organizations. The folks most affected by the issues that we're working on, poverty and food insecurity, are excluded from leading the solution finding. That's horrible. How are we going to come to effective solutions if we're not listening to the people that are most affected? So here's how FoodShare does things differently, and how we acknowledge and understand the ways in which white supremacy exists, and the ways in which it informs our work, but most importantly, how we work to dismantle it. So the first thing that I'll outline is when we post a position at FoodShare, it's one thing to post on Workopolis. I don't know if people still post on Workopolis or if that's still a thing, but to post on Workopolis and Charity Village and all of these sorts of places, that's one thing. And that's often the default approach for many charities and organizations. And we're going to get the same types of people who are told that that's the place to go to look for jobs. So what we do instead, or in addition to, I should say, is we reach out to some equity-seeking groups, or I prefer equity-deserving groups, that we work with and that we've come to know. Folks that are working specifically in these communities. So when it comes to posting a position, we will give folks a call, and we will, at those organizations, at those community groups, and say, hey, we've got this position up. Let us know if you have any questions. But it goes beyond that. It also includes, when resumes come our way, we have an anonymized resume review process. So there's one person whose function it is at FoodShare to remove names, addresses, where someone went to school, all of those pieces that the research is there that says that those are the things that inspire bias and ultimately act as barriers to access to employment for BIPOC folks. We also de-emphasize paid accreditations like college, university, and the like. There are very few positions that we find really, really require paid accreditations. And when that is the case, we will try and find ways to cover those costs, because we know that not everyone has equal access to paid accreditation, or even university. Not everyone has equal access to go and live in another community for 4 years and study and be able to do all the ththings that they need to do to survive. FoodShare also takes guidance and collaborates with an Indigenous advisory circle, as well as a 60-member advisory committee. And on that advisory committee, we prioritize racialized folks, our BIPOC folks. We provide honorariums when we get together, and when we get together in general, regardless. When we get together in person, we also provide a meal, provide cover transportation costs, public transportation costs, as well as provide childcare. So it's some of the ways that we make it possible to glean the advice that we need to collaborate with these communities. And of course, an honorarium is key to acknowledge the sharing of their experience. We also took a look at our pay grid. Maybe in about 2018, we started to dive into our pay grid and made a conscious decision that we were going to introduce a transparent pay grid, and that we were going to give the folks on the bottom of the pay grid a 25% increase. That was in about 2018. Since then, we have introduced, since last January, we introduced another 4% increase on top of that. And that one was across the board, except to the highest paid folks in our organization. And we're also, since I guess 2018, our lowest paid workers have seen an increase in their compensation by 29%. Food insecurity is not about food. I'll probably talk about that a little bit later, but it's really about income. So being able to increase the income levels of our lowest paid workers, that's having a direct impact on people's ability to access food, on our colleagues' ability to access food. And my team and I this week, we're putting the finishing touches on looking on being able to become a living wage employer within the next year. We also introduced a lowest paid to highest paid ratio because these issues that are happening, where we have often white, often male CEOs and racialized folks at the lower end of pay ratios, receiving significantly different levels of compensation. So at FoodShare, the highest paid employee can make no more than 3.7 times what the lowest paid employee makes. These are the kinds of things that I think demonstrate that we're all in this together, that we're working collectively towards achieving something. We're not working towards building a CEO's cottage or second home or what have you. We are working to tackle food insecurity, poverty, and white supremacy, and we're modeling how to do that within this organization. And this commitment didn't begin with a black square on Instagram last summer. We started way before all of this, and did so because we felt it was the work, it was what we needed to be doing, and it was critical to doing our work authentically. Much of FoodShare's work is rooted, like I say, and also, one of the ways we think about this is, we're also challenging the chronic underinvestment in communities, in low-income communities. Again, communities that are, most likely to be made up of racialized folks. So what we do is we intentionally work with folks in those communities to build resident-led community infrastructure. So one of the ways also we're challenging neoliberalism and capitalism that has allowed for the non-investment, that this chronic lack of investment in these communities. So we're helping build resident-led, community-owned food infrastructure. An example of that is, there's a new Scarborough co-op market. And that market is one of the 50 what we call good food markets across the city of Toronto, which in essence, which really are subsidized produce markets that FoodShare works alongside communities to establish. And I remember when they launched their website, I loved what it said on the website. It was beautiful. And it said that the Scarborough Co-op Market is a place made for and by the community to support each other in making sure we all have what we need to have an enjoyable quality of life. Another example for FoodShare and how we do this work and think about how to leverage our resources to have a maximum impact is we launched something called, we've had this thing called the Good Food Box for a number of years. Launched in 1994. Where folks can order a beautiful box of fresh produce from us, the type of produce that you would see at a high-end grocery store. And we, again, challenging capitalism. We're not looking to increase shareholder dividends. We're looking to get wonderful food out to folks who deserve it, all of us. So we are buying millions of pounds of produce each year. So a couple of years ago, we launched something called the Dismantling White Supremacy Good Food Box. It's a good food box that during the growing season prioritizes local BIPOC growers and brings the produce that they grow to folks right across the city of Toronto. This kind of intentionality is important. For us, it's no more of this, we don't see race in this work. If you don't see race, you don't see me. You don't see my ancestors or the ways in which people that look like me have been harmed by white supremacy in many of our public spaces, our public policies, and public institutions. Things that are meant to be for all of us, things that are meant to serve, protect all of us. Despite talking, I talked a lot about what I think is difficult work ahead for us all if we really want to commit to dismantling these societal ills. Despite describing it as hard work, my mother Bernadine raised an optimist. Most days it feels like a blessing. Some days it feels like a curse, but today it really feels like a blessing. And I believe that we can do better. That's why I do the work that I do. That's why I get up and I'm excited to do it every day. It's because I believe that better is possible. But I know that it's going to take all of us, a true commitment from every single one of us. So I really hope you think about the spheres in which you have influence, whether it's around the dinner table, whether it's with your friend group, and that you'll join me and my colleagues in making the possible a reality. Thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure to speak with you this morning. And I'll say, one of the things I find when I share some of these thoughts with folks is, it takes a bit to think about them, reflect on them, and you may have questions or comments that pop up after the fact. So what I'm going to say, and I'll put this in the chat, is please do feel free to reach out to me on social media. I'm on all of the different platforms at Paul Taylor TO. So feel free to reach out and do feel free to send a question, send thoughts or reflection. I will get back to you. Thanks again. It's been a real pleasure. I look forward to hearing some of your questions.
Thank you so much, Paul. I feel like this would have been a deafening applause if everybody was unmuted right now. What a powerful way to open this conference. I have a million questions, but my role is to be the moderator. So I'll take a pass and turn to, I'm going to try and see who has the first questions. In the chat box, Paul has just posted his Twitter handle if you want to look him up. But we're open now for questions, and I'm gonna just kind of try and scroll. I realize now that we have excellent attendance. We have over 50 participants online right now, so I can't fit you all on one screen, so I might have to go back and forth between pages to see the raised hands. But we have, again, in line with Paul's generosity, we have a good half an hour for this discussion, so we're open for questions now.
I'll try my best to answer them. Yeah, I may not have the answer, but I'm certainly happy to share my thoughts.
Maybe, and I feel like maybe this is exactly what you suggested towards the end of your talk, Paul, that people just need a minute maybe to process. One of the things that I'm curious about, if I may start with the questions then, is typically at this conference, we have keynote speakers who are traditional academics. And I noticed Leah Wilson has her hand up. Thank you, Blue. Leah, you'll come up next. I wanted to ask you sort of how do you find because you speak to so many different audiences. And this is a very refreshing talk for us, I think, to hear from somebody who's doing, who understands the academic world, but is doing very kind of practical, on the ground, crucial work in our society. So with that in mind, how do you find the different audiences that you address, whether it's, a TVO appearance or a CBC live panel, or some of the things you post online and in your columns, and the different talks you might be giving? How do you find the reception is for the ideas you're presenting? Because as much as, I would like to think that this group is quite open to these ideas, and we have been thinking about many of the concerns that you have raised in the last half an hour. Some audiences may not have the similar understanding or be as receptive of the ideas that you're presenting. How do you find your addresses to the public have been received, especially in the last year? Because I think you've gained so much prominence in this pandemic, because so many things that you've been talking about for years have really come to a head in the last year.
Oh, that's a great question. And I guess I would start with saying, and I mean, I don't mean this to any offense to anyone watching and listening today, but I don't often think a lot about the audience. I think about, because I find that I would be contorting my message and my thinking and doing somersaults for various audiences. So I think about my heart, and I try my hardest to keep open. I try my hardest to be honest and to connect with other people's hearts and minds. And I feel like regardless of our experiences, regardless of how we look at the world, and I try to encourage people, before I share my thoughts, to, please have an open mind and an open heart. Because that's how I've learned so much in my life, especially, in lots of ways. But without a doubt, there are people, can you imagine a nonprofit organization launching something called the Dismantling White Supremacy Box? Yes, we get angry emails, we get phone calls from funders. But in the same way that, our core constituency at FoodShare is not our funders. And that's been a really interesting shift for me to help lead my colleagues in thinking that for many nonprofits, we think that our core constituency, or we may not say it, but the way in which we act is that our core constituency is our funders. Our core constituencies are people who have positions of power in society or political officials. None of those folks are our core constituencies. They have the opportunity to contribute and reflect on our work. Our core constituency are the folks in community who have not been centered for generations. So when those folks call and they get upset because of something we're doing, that's a whole other conversation. When I got a call from Opal, who's been volunteering at FoodShare for decades, and she's excited about something that we're doing, my colleagues receive that in a different way than when we get a call from someone that gives us hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to do some work. And that means that we're also not afraid to say, even when they're big dollars, we're not afraid to say thank you, but no thank you. the work that you're doing outside in the world might undermine the work that we're hoping to do. So we can't accept those dollars and hope you can find a place that works for you. So I think it's being open, being brave, and I have some incredible white allies, colleagues of mine, and other leaders who sometimes I don't have the energy and the time to deal with the angry person commenting about the white supremacy box or anything that we're doing or writing about it on social media. So I find that some of those folks who, recognize that, oh, maybe Paul, maybe racialized people shouldn't have to deal with angry white folks, and they jump in and they help, and that's been really, really useful.
Thank
Great
you.
question.
That's a great answer. Leah, over to you. If you can unmute yourself and ask your question, please.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Paul, for this really engaging presentation so far. I have two questions. The first is kind of about social organizing, because I do some poverty alleviation work where I'm from in Manitoba. And when the pandemic happened, we called to increase EIA from the bare minimum rate of $800 a month to at least $1,000, which was obviously half of what the federal government was recognizing was a basic income. And we got absolutely no traction provincially from that. So kind of my question is, what do you do when your asks get really no traction? And like, how do you keep working when some of the systems that many of us work against are so stagnant and really can't have such little like malleability? And then the second question that I have is, how did your organization come to the 3.7 times wage ratio?
Great question.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leah. I guess the first question is, I love these questions around traction. And I would say we've got to flip the way we think about traction on its head. Again, it's about, we think that we have traction often in some of the spaces that I've been in. I feel like I have felt like in the past that we have traction when our political leaders, when folks with a great deal of access to power resources start listening or talking or moving on the things that we're talking about. But the traction actually begins in community. And I feel like in our organizing, we don't often realize that. We try and say something and get politicians or whoever to listen. But I think we've got to rethink our organizing as well around building bigger coalitions, building people power. And I think that's where the traction happens. And when we invest in building that kind of excitement and the dynamism around organizing in new ways, truly listening, I've been involved in some really exciting, what I think are listening campaigns that take 1.5 to 2 years. But it's so worth it, because when that traction starts to happen, and when you've been, I was involved in a project where when I lived in Vancouver, where we were organizing with folks in faith-based communities, a variety of them, for folks in academic institutions, community organizations, labor organizations, but ultimately at the end of all of that, we were coming together around some core things that we really believed in collectively. And there may have been tons of things that we disagreed on, but we left those things outside of the room and focused on the things that we agreed on and really recognized and built our collective people power. And that was the traction that political officials and whoever can't avoid, that kind of traction. So, the result of that, some of that work included the city of Vancouver becoming a living wage employer. Because when you have such a diverse coalition, instead of one group saying, hey, we represent 600,000 people, or no, sorry, 250,000 people, and we are committed to seeing the city of Vancouver lead on living wage, the city of Vancouver can't ignore or avoid that kind of traction. So I'd say that's the first part. In terms of the ratio that we developed, the ratio actually came afterwards. We focused on looking at because ratios don't mean anything, right, really. They mean a little bit, but it could mean that, what we focused on is making sure that we were increasing wages at at the bottom end and really introduce the ratio afterwards. Because in my experience in nonprofit organizations, executive directors or CEOs compensation happens in a boardroom. CEO or ED sits with the board says, oh, you're doing such great work. We're going to give you a bonus, or we're going to increase your salary by this amount. And the ED says, wonderful. And they go back to their work, perhaps where their colleagues are being paid shitty wages, where their colleagues don't have enough food to eat. So this is one of the ways that we decided that we want to lock this in. You know, one day I may not be a food chair, and I want to make sure it's hard to unlock it. So it's actually a policy that keeps those wages together. So I get that question all the time around how did you develop the ratio? We focused on the dollars and the cents, and then locked in a ratio so that that kind of income inequality that happens in corporations and nonprofits, that we could be combating that today and into the future.
Great. Thank you, Leah, for those excellent questions. We have another question from Aditi that has been posted in the chat box if anybody wants to have a look, but I'll just read it out loud. And I see, Jonathan, you have your hand up, so I'll go to you next. The question from Aditi is, thank you, Paul, for a great keynote. My question, generally when thinking about increasing the income for low strata population, what high-level methodological framework or lens help understand the key players and their roles, or analyzing the situation on ground? I really like this question because I was wondering too, you know, as most of us are researchers on this call, any advice or requests that you might have? What would you like to see academics do more of, and how? What kinds of things should we be keeping in mind when we approach research around social inequity, and especially issues around income?
Ooh, just got me excited. I think I got goosebumps at that question. It also got an idea flowing. But I would say the first thing I would say to start, the first thing I would say is there has been some great research out there that we access. And it's around what is a living wage in the region in which we are working. And for us, we recognize that that's where we're moving towards, because it's a crisis of, it's a real crisis. If we are paying people and they're not able to live in the regions in which we work. So that's the thing that we're looking at, and we look at the living wage calc that's been calculated in BC. It was the Center for it was the CCPA, the Canadian Center for Policy Alternatives, that calculates that annually. I think various CCPA offices across the country will calculate living wage rates. So that's what we go towards. You know, as I think about, one of the things that I would be really interested in is, further thinking about what does it mean to be a food justice employer, and what is a food justice wage, living wage, and how might it differentiate from the living wage calculations. I think that's something that I would love to kind of toss around potentially with some researchers, some folks diving into that work, and then perhaps starting a movement around, depending on which one's higher, a living wage, I imagine a food justice employer might be, but starting a movement around encouraging particularly organizations in the food space and corporations to be food justice employers.
And would you have any recommendations for Aditi and the rest of us in terms of the actual approach that would help us understand who the key players are and their roles in our efforts to improve social equity and income equity in particular?
I think it's the folks who live the inequities are the folks that we've got to center and be listening to and learning from. It's got to be, and I'll say one thing, and it would be too popular, but one of the things I realize, and I think this is especially important for researchers, is when we're asking questions of folks who have interacted with, generations of systemic inequities, generations of neglect, it can condition, society can condition the way we may respond to some questions. For example, I remember doing some research. I think food bank lineups are horrific. When I lived in Vancouver, I would think about the lack of privacy that food bank users had when they were lining up outside in what's often cold and rainy Vancouver. So I would spend some time in those lineups trying to talk with folks, make jokes, and just get to know people in my community. And you know, I would ask folks, what do you think about the food? How's the food? And people would say, oh, it's wonderful. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to have this food. I don't know what I would do with the food bank. And as soon as I would say to them, oh, you know, when I've gone to food banks, the food's been kind of shitty, and it's okay to say that it is. And then people start to have a whole different kind of conversation. So we have to recognize, I think, the way that charity especially has caused some people who engage with charity to respond, especially in those initial types of questions, especially when they might feel like there's a risk of disconnection from the access to the charity that that may provide, even though it might be food-like substances. This is something that folks have become accustomed to. So I think that's something to be mindful, but certainly you want to make sure that you're centering the folks who have been most affected.
Great, thank you. I do have a couple more questions waiting here. So Jonathan, I'll ask you to unmute yourself and ask your question. You've been waiting patiently.
Awesome, thank you. First off, Paul Taylor, holy crap, that was amazing. That was awesome. So our paper that we wrote about kind of talks about the mechanics of like identifying whiteness, its harmful effects, and kind of a little discussion about what we can do about that. And I'm wondering, working in the food sector, the food insecurity sector, you must come across this sort of brand of white saviorism and this kind of toxic whiteness a lot. I'm just wondering, do you have thoughts about like how to combat that? Oh,
it's time to stop.
Google's talking. If you have any thoughts about how to combat that, and just in like allyship as well, like what skills are good for white folks who are working in these kind of spaces to try to avoid these sorts of toxicity?
Great question. Yeah, I come across it all the time. It's called charity. It's called traditional charity. And I guess my first approach is, because I recognize that charity and charity law comes from 16th century UK. Around, you know, I was around how do lovely middle class and above white folks respond to the issues of food insecurity or poverty, which continues to this day. So I try charity, you know, in its purest sense is very lovely. You know, we want to help people. But I try and have conversations with people about the reality of charity, about what it means to be on the recipient end, and how it actually may allow these problems to remain in place. When we have organized, I'm going to have so many thoughts, so if I don't answer, please just say, Paul, please answer. But, you know, when we have nonprofit organizations that are told to behave like businesses, well, then, of course, we're looking to grow our budgets, we're looking to get bigger. And one of the things that I've seen as a result is that charities are telling people that we are solving poverty and food insecurity. So, and I think people with power resources, people with privilege going into these organizations who are told these messages and then are repeating these messages in their spheres of influence is quite harmful. So I would say one of the first things is kind of reorienting that conversation to talk about injustices. And I also try to talk about the fact that in Canada, we have a right to food. It's not a right to other people's leftovers. It's not a right to corporate dumping. We have a right to food, and that we want folks to help us to make sure that we can actualize that right. I would say that's one thing. And I also encourage people, we all come to this work from different places. So I often encourage people to think about where they have privilege in society, where they have power, where they have access to power resources, and leverage those and use that power and privilege to have the kind of conversations that work at dismantling these harmful notions for folks. The last thing I'll say on this question is, it comes to, again, who our core constituency is. So sometimes we'll have donors who say, you know, can I have a tour of whatever it is? And I say, no, that's not your space. Your space is, this is a space that we're holding specifically in almost a sacred space for folks. We're not going to treat people like it's a museum or a zoo and trod people through so that they can feel good about their contributions. So I think it's about challenging also those expectations when you want to do something to make things better. It may not always come with a pat on the back. It may not always come with a tour. It may not come with a postcard of some smiling folks. But it takes time, and it's not going to happen overnight. I don't know if I answered your question, but I went on for a while.
You did. That was great. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Excellent. Holly, I realize now we have two Hollies on the call. Holly Rowland, you're up next.
Hi there. Thank you so much, Paul, for your talk. Coming to you from the UK today, so it's an early afternoon here. But anyway, I was quite struck by your point about the connection between wage insecurity and food insecurity as being quite obvious. But something that seems less obvious to me is the insecurity of, say, contracts, like working contracts. So here in the UK, particularly at universities, there's quite an issue with people being on these rolling or otherwise, you know, associate kind of work contracts. So it's I guess it's more of a statement to respond to than a question. But if the wage on a contract like that seems, you know, appropriate, but the job itself is insecure, is there some kind of connection the food insecurity charities can make with, for the example that I myself am actually subject to, you know, higher education institutions, wherein someone may be kind of climbing the social ladder, so to speak, but still face that insecurity and be most vulnerable to it?
Without a doubt, precarious employment, the rise of gig work, all of that that type of work is really undermining food insecurity. It's undermining, you know, challenging poverty. So for us as an organization, it's interesting because we developed a combating anti-Black racism strategy. It took about a year and a half, and again, didn't start with a black square last summer. But one of the things that we've included in our combating anti-Black racism strategy is a commitment to create as often as possible full-time work. So it's not, I talked about the income, but it's also, just like you highlight, Holly, the type of work that you're creating, because I think nonprofits are particularly, well, nonprofits and large corporations, who am I kidding? But nonprofits certainly as well, is that we will sometimes say, oh, here's a pot of money, but the funder won't allow us to pay this much, or what have you. So we feel like the work is to say, hey, funder, you are sentencing someone to food insecurity, you're sentencing someone to precarity. And I thought you were with us in wanting to address these issues. So just correct me if I'm wrong. And you'll be surprised with how quickly funders find more money and find ways and re-announce funding streams. That type of thing is possible if positioned the right way. I just think you mentioned that you're in the UK. If you're not familiar already, I would really encourage you to check out the work of Nourish Scotland. There's some good folks doing awesome work there, great friends and great allies. Yeah, so I'd encourage you if you haven't already.
Superb. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Paul, if I may ask another question that I kind of came to mind as soon as you started talking about the food bank lineups. I live next door to one, and I've noticed how longer and longer these lineups are getting in the past year. And for those of us who work in food, your critique of food banks is obvious, but I'm not sure that everybody on this call today will actually be aware of some of the concerns and the history of food banks in Canada. Would you mind maybe speaking to that a little bit more?
Oh, pleasure. You know, I had that as that's so funny. There were two things I have on my notes here, but I'm like, I've got to find a way to squeeze those into answers to questions, and that was one of them. So thank you for asking it directly.
I swear I'm not a plant.
So food banks started in Canada, at least in 1981, you know, shortly after a recession. And, you know, what we've seen is food banks started mainly in faith-based communities. There would be a pantry or something like that, and a minister or whoever's a cupboard that folks could come in and access. And when you think about how they've grown from that space to where they are now, these large institutions with significant budgets, I think has a lot to do with the way politicians have neglected their duty to advance economic and social policy to address food insecurity. And instead, I often say, what they do is they go and take selfies or photos of them sorting tins at food banks instead of sorting the policy. So I also, I think food banks are very dangerous. I remember being, this is about maybe 10 years ago, even doing some interviews, and people did not like hearing this, but I've continued to say it. I think food banks are very dangerous because ultimately we have, maybe before I go into how dangerous food banks are, I should say one thing. 1981, there's this recession. There's also something really important that happens. Canada as a country shifts from the very European model of income-based interventions to challenge poverty. And we switch to, the model that had been present in the US, which was food-based interventions. With that, we saw the retrenchment, and as part of neoliberalism, we saw the retrenchment of the social safety net. Many of our social programs became gutted. And now the most concerning thing is that there was never a debate in Parliament. There was never a political or national discourse on making this shift. It just happened. So it really, I think, speaks to the role of corporations and the influence that corporations have on policy. I think politicians decide who wins in the economy, and the folks who win in the economy decide who our politicians are going to be, and then ultimately what our public policy looks like. So now we're looking at the context of food banks that we've all come to love and appreciate. Food banks are, for many corporations, they produce excess food, they mislabel something, instead of having to pay for dumping it themselves, they now call up a food bank. And it's no surprise that some of our largest corporations will invest in infrastructure for food banks. So trucks, one-time investments in a truck, so that truck can go to the corporation and pick up their waste on an ongoing basis. Not only do they not have to pay for it, the corporation doesn't have to pay for it, but they get a halo in addition to that. So I think in a lot of ways, food banks have not only allowed politicians to skirt their right to food responsibilities, but they've actually bolstered capitalism, bolstered their largest corporations by making them appear to be doing something lovely that ultimately increases their bottom line. And sometimes they get tax receipts.
Thank you not only for answering my question, but also for putting it in such terms that I think, we do talk a lot about political economy and capitalism in our field. And I think what your answer is going to resonate with the attendees quite well. I know you said you had one more question, one more thing that you wanted to squeeze, but I do have a couple of questions still coming up. Jonathan has a follow-up question, I think, in response to this last answer. Jonathan, go ahead.
Sort of. It's a little bit of a sidetracking, but it's also kind of related to the whole discussion more broadly. So from a research perspective, there's a lot of really great research in communities in Toronto, a lot of really great research in communities in Ottawa. And maybe this is my own personal bias because I'm from a rural town, but what do you think is the role of academics looking into these kind of equity issues, these inequality issues, and kind of broadening their lens and looking at smaller places, maybe outside of these major urban centers?
Great question. I'm mindful. I get that question sometimes as well, but I'm mindful of not answering it. But I'm very honest when I'm not answering a question because it's not my place to. I've lived in a city my whole life. I work at an organization that works across the city of Toronto. So while I think that we need to learn more, I wouldn't be the person to center in figuring out how and next steps and those sorts of things. But I would agree. I think there is a lack of research that's specific to rural communities and the issues that rural communities face around food insecurity. But with that said, I just want to highlight when we are talking about, I would be remiss if I didn't say this. Ultimately, maybe I did say it, but food insecurity is an issue of income. So we've got to be talking about income. For me, when we're talking about food insecurity and the difference between rural and urban communities, we're talking about income variations and cost of living conversations, where there may be more research done and less about food. And I think for so many of us, when we think about food insecurity, it's almost a bit of a deceptive term. And, you know, food banks have allowed us to think that this is an issue of food. But I just want to underscore something I've been saying a lot recently is that, and I'm not saying that you were suggesting this, but I'm just squeezing in that other point that I wanted to get in. And it's that, you know, low-income people are not compost bins. And I think many of our interventions, because we've focused on food-based interventions, we say, okay, let's one step above compost or one step above discarding that food is throwing it into the mouths of low-income people, and completely misses the mark. I feel like there's, and maybe this goes back a little bit to Irina's question or the question before about food banks, you know, I think these schemes around food distribution are really important, food redistribution, really important in some, you know, when it comes to challenging climate change, they must be had, but they're not solutions that are going to tackle food insecurity. So I'm pretty critical of organizations, food security organizations that start talking about these food redistribution schemes.
Thank you for that. If I was better at multitasking, I'd be live tweeting the compost comment, because that's a really memorable one. Thank you, Paul. We're coming up to 10:15 now, and I want to make sure that everybody, that the rest of the folks on this call are going to have a long day with a number of sessions the rest of the day. So I want to make sure everybody gets a break from 10:15 to 10:30. Before I actually officially close it, I just want to remind the attendees that the next panel will start at 10:30. Actually, two parallel panels. So I'm sure you all have the schedule. You can look up the information or get in touch with one of the organizers with more information. I expected this to be an amazing opening keynote, Paul, but I think you've exceeded my expectations, and I hope the organizers will concur. Thank you so much for making the time to have this amazing conversation with us. And I think you've given us a lot to talk about over the next 2 days of this conference.
Thank you so much. It's been a real honor to be here. Appreciate your interest in some of the work that my colleagues and I are working on.
Excellent.
Great to meet everyone.
And I see this again would be a deafening applause, I suppose, if we were in person. So maybe one of these days we will get a chance to do that as well.
That'd be lovely.
And I will keep the chat box open here because there's a number of thank yous streaming in. Incredible talk, wonderful talk. Thank you so much. So really appreciate your time today. Blue, I'm going to hand Blue, I'm going to hand it over to you for any closing remarks before we end this session and go into the break.
I'm just speechless. It's such an amazing keynote, sets an amazing tone for the entire conference. Thank you so much, Paul. Thank you so much, Irina, for chairing this event. Because there is another panel coming, so I'm just gonna wrap it up. Thank you everyone for being here with us this morning, and thank you, Paul, once again.